Hey guy, welcome back to Sleep Among Titans, where we drift through strange and quiet corners of the past, perfect for listening before you sleep. Tonight we're visiting the original off-the-grid lifestyle, the American frontier. Let's be honest, it's an idea that's been romanticized into oblivion, little log cabins, rugged self-sufficiency, all that. But beneath the cozy aesthetic was a simple brutal contract DIY or you die. There was no artisanal sourdough starter, no one to call if the Wi-Fi went out, because your only form of connection was the trail you blazed yourself. We're not going to tell the story of a whole lifetime. Just one night. The coldest night. We'll see how a family faced a level of cold that was less like weather and more like an uninvited houseguest named hypothermia. Their survival didn't depend on one big heroic act, but on 100 tiny forgotten details. What did they see in the sky that afternoon that tipped them off? What ancient ritual-like steps did they take to turn their home into a fortress? So let's go there now. Let's leave today behind. The air inside the small cabin is still. For now. The only sound is the gentle crackle and spit of the fire, a small sun holding back the darkness. But another sound is beginning to gather outside. At first, it's just a low hum in the distance, then it grows into a thin whine. Elias, the father, shifts on his straw mattress. He isn't asleep. He's listening. He's heard the winter wind 1,000 times, but this is different. This wind doesn't just blow against the cabin. It feels like it's looking for a way and testing every log, every chink filled with mud and moss. This isn't just a cold night. This is a hunter, and the hunt has just begun. So what kind of dream, or what kind of desperation brings you to a place where the wind itself sounds like it wants you gone? For Elias and Sarah, it was a promise. A promise whispered in crowded cities back east, printed on pamphlets that were the 19th century version of a glossy real estate brochure. The promise of land. 160 acres to call your own. The promise of freedom, which, let's be clear, was also the freedom to fail, spectacularly, with no one around to even notice. They had spent 2 years turning that promise into something real. And that reality was the small, sturdy cabin now standing between them and the hunting wind. This wasn't some charming rustic getaway. Every single log was felled, hauled and notched by Elias, his hands shaping his family's survival one splinter at a time. Every gap between those logs was chinked with a mixture of mud and moss, packed in by Sarah's patient fingers turning walls into a shield. The cabin was a tiny stubborn fist of warmth clenched against the vast indifferent wilderness. And they had prepared for winter. Oh, absolutely. The woodpile outside, now buried somewhere under the snow, had been a monument to a summer of back-breaking work. Inside shelves held jars of preserved berries and salted meat hung from the rafters. They had done everything right. They'd followed the almanac, watched the migration of the birds, and listened to the advice of the 1 or 2 other souls they'd met out here. They had prepared for the enemy they knew. But as Elias lies there listening to that alien sound in the wind, a new and terrible thought begins to form. What if this isn't the enemy they prepared for? What if this is something new? He starts rewinding the day in his mind, searching for the clues he must have missed. What were the first signs that this wasn't just another storm, that the old rules no longer applied? His mind didn't have to go far back. Just a handful of hours. Back to the late afternoon when he was standing at the edge of the woods deciding if he had enough daylight for one last check of his snare line. He decided against it. It's one of those small, seemingly lazy decisions you later realize might have saved your life, and that's when he first noticed it. The first clue wasn't a sound or a feeling, it was the light. Usually the late afternoon sun would slant through the pines, bathing the snow in a soft golden glow. It was a gentle, forgiving light, the kind that makes you forget how sharp and dangerous the world can be. But this was different. The light had become thin, brittle. It was a stark, clinical white light that stripped all the warmth from the landscape, making the shadows of the trees look like jagged black cracks in the snow. It was like someone had swapped the sun for a giant celestial fluorescent bulb, humming with a cold, sterile energy. He tilted his head up, squinting. The sky directly overhead was a pale, washed-out blue, but at the western horizon a colour was gathering. It wasn't the friendly pink or orange of a normal sunset. It was a deep, bruised purple, a colour that had no business being in the sky. It looked less like a sunset and more like an infection spreading just beyond the edge of the world. It was an unnatural beauty, the kind that makes the hair on your arm stand up. The kind of beauty that signals something is deeply, fundamentally wrong. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not a sky that promised a peaceful night. He stood there for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the strange vivid world this light had created. And in that moment of stillness, he noticed the second sign, which was in its own way far more terrifying than the sky. The silence. Now there's quiet and then there's silence. The frontier was always quiet. But it was a living quiet, a tapestry woven from 1,000 tiny sounds. The chatter of a squirrel telling him off for existing too close to its tree. The rustle of a snowshoe hare in the frozen underbrush. The distant mocking cry of a blue jay. The forest was a constant low-level conversation. But now, nothing. The conversation had stopped. He stood perfectly still, straining his ears. The squirrels, who were basically the neighborhood watch of the forest, and usually had an opinion on everything, were gone. Not a single chirp. The birds were silent. The air itself was so still it felt heavy, pressurized like the moments before a lightning strike. It was the deep collective breath the world takes before it screams. This was an empty silence, a void. It meant that every living thing that could run, fly or burrow had already gotten the memo. They had seen the purple sky, felt something in their bones that he was only just beginning to understand, and had made themselves scarce. The entire forest was hiding, and Elias was standing out in the open. A cold dread, colder than the air, began to seep into him. He turned and started walking back toward the cabin, his boots crunching unnaturally loud in the profound stillness. His path took him past the lean-to where they kept Bessie, their one and only milk cow. Bessie was, for lack of a better word, a rock. A placid, cud-chewing, four-legged lesson in absolute stoicism. Nothing fazed her, but she wasn't chewing her cud now. She was pressed into the furthest corner of her shelter, her back to the world. Her head was up, her ears were twitching, and her eyes were wide, staring at nothing Elias could see. She was tense, rigid, a statue of bovine fear. She had heard the memo too. In a world with no telegraphs or newspapers, you learn to read the headlines written in the behavior of animals. And Bessie's headline for the evening news was simply terror. That was the final confirmation. The light was a warning, the silence was a confirmation, and the cow's fear was the final non-negotiable verdict. He didn't run. Panic was a luxury you couldn't afford out here. It burned calories you needed to survive. He just walked faster, his mind no longer asking what was coming, but how they would meet it. He reached the cabin door and paused, peering through the single small pane of glass. He could see Sarah inside, humming softly as she stirred a pot over the fire. Little Anna was on the floor, carefully arranging a family of pine cones. They were safe in their little bubble of warmth and light, completely unaware of the bruised sky and the silent, terrified world outside. It was his job to keep that bubble from bursting. His mind became a checklist. The shutters, the woodpile by the door needed to be bigger, the water barrels, the tiny crack under the door he'd been meaning to fix for a week. Every small, forgotten task suddenly became a matter of life and death. And now, lying in the dark as that prophesied storm rages outside, he finds a sliver of comfort in the memory. He hadn't been oblivious. He had seen the signs. He had read the warning written across the sky and in the silence of the woods. He had done what he could. But as the cabin groans under the assault, he knows that seeing the enemy coming and surviving its attack are two very, very different things. And the first part of the ritual, the sealing of their tiny fortress, was about to begin. He didn't need to say a word. He pushed the door open, and a sliver of that cold, violet-tinged air sliced into the room. It wasn't just a draft. It felt like a presence crossing the threshold. Sarah, who had been humming a tune over the stew pot, stopped mid-note. She looked up first at the slice of bruised sky visible behind him, then at his face, and she knew. In the silent language shared by two people who depend on each other for everything, he had already told her all she needed to know. The low-level hum of their evening routine was over. The performance was about to begin. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady, robbing the words of any panic. "We need more wood inside. All of it. And the shutter. Now." The now hung in the air, absolute. What followed was not a frantic scramble, but a practiced, urgent dance. A ritual. Elias stepped back out into the biting cold, his body a shield against the wind that was beginning to stir. He began grabbing logs from the woodpile, not the small, neat stack by the door for daily use, but the main hulking pile, the one that represented a summer's worth of sweat and toil. He worked with a grim efficiency, his arms moving like pistons. Sarah stood in the doorway, the firelight at her back. She became the next link in the chain. He would pass her 2, sometimes 3 logs at a time, and she would take them, pivot, and stack them against the inside wall. The pile grew with astonishing speed. It was no longer just fuel for the fire, it was becoming another layer of insulation and interior wall built of stored sunlight and summer heat. Log after log, the space inside the cabin shrank, becoming denser, more focused. The scrape of bark on the wooden doorframe, the dull, solid thud of logs landing on the floorboards, the sharp intake of their own breath, it all became a single rhythmic engine, working against the clock of the falling temperature. They brought in enough for 1 night, then enough for 2. Elias didn't stop until the pile reached his waist. Only then did he seem satisfied. He stepped inside for the last time, and together they pushed the heavy wooden door shut. The heavy bar dropped into its brackets with a loud, definitive clunk. The outside world was now locked out. Almost. Next came the window. It was the cabin's single eye, a small pane of precious, warped glass that looked out onto the woods. Now it was a vulnerability. Elias lifted the heavy wooden shutter into place. It was thick, solid oak, and when he slid the thick wooden bolt across it, plunged the room into a dim, firelit twilight. The last of the strange, beautiful, terrifying light was gone. They were now in their tomb, or their womb. The next few hours would decide which. And now the most important part of the ritual, the sealing of the cracks. Sarah turned to little Anna, who had been watching this strange silent activity with wide eyes. "All right, my little spider," Sarah said, her voice magically light and cheerful. "It's time for the web game. We have to make sure our little house is all tucked in." From a worn burlap sack, Anna began to pull out the tools of their trade, long strips of old cloth, saved for this very purpose, and clumps of dried moss they'd collected in the late fall. For Anna, it was a wonderful game. She would hand a strip of cloth to her father, or a clump of moss to her mother, and watch as they meticulously worked it into the seams of the cabin. They moved along the walls in opposite directions, their hands knowing every weak spot by heart. They were like ancient shipwrights caulking the hull of their tiny vessel before a great storm. Elias used his knife to poke the cloth deep into the gaps where the logs met. Sarah followed with the moss, packing it in tightly, creating a final dense seal. Push-pack seal, move 6 inches, push-pack seal. It was a slow, quiet, methodical act of defiance. Every sealed crack was a small victory, a tiny no said to the howling void. The final touches were small but critical. A thick, rolled-up blanket was wedged against the bottom of the door, a final barrier against the most insidious drafts. Elias reached up and adjusted the chimney flue, closing it just enough to slow the escape of precious heat, a calculation he knew by feel. Sarah, for her part, brought their largest cast-iron pot, filled it with fresh snow from just outside the door, and placed it near the hearth, ensuring they would have water without having to unseal their fortress later. Finally, it was done. They gathered in the center of the room, the 3 of them. The cabin felt different now. Smaller, darker the air, thick with the smell of wood-smoke pine and the faint, savory scent of the stew. It was no longer just a house. It was an ark, a lifeboat. The world outside had ceased to exist. All that mattered was what was inside these 4 walls. The silence that followed was profound. It was the silence of a sealed chamber. All they could hear was the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. And then they heard it. The low hum of the wind they'd heard earlier was gone. In its place came the first true gust of the storm. It wasn't a whine or a howl. It was a physical, percussive blow against the west wall, a heavy shove, as if a giant had decided to test their work. The ritual was complete, the fortress was sealed, and the siege had just begun. The siege had begun. That first heavy shove against the wall was not an isolated event. It was an announcement, a declaration of intent. Another blow landed, then another. Soon the individual impacts blended into a single, overwhelming reality, a deep, continuous roar that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was the sound of a monstrous ocean 1,000 miles from any coast, and their small cabin was nothing but a tiny wooden bottle tossed upon its waves. Inside, the family sat motionless for a long moment, letting the sheer volume of the world wash over them. All their hard work sealing the cracks and barring the door was being tested not by a simple draft, but by what felt like a solid wall of sound and fury. The air in the cabin vibrated, the floorboards hummed with a low-frequency energy. This was the new reality, and within this roar a whole symphony of other stranger sounds began to make themselves known. First, there was the voice of the wind itself, a voice with many moods. The main roar was its chest, but its throat was the chimney. From it came a high, mournful howl, the sound of a vast and profound loneliness. It was a clean, pure note of loss that went on, rising and falling in pitch, but never ever stopping for breath. It sang a song of absolute emptiness, of a world scoured clean of warmth and life. And beneath that howl was a sharper, more insidious sound, a whistle. It came from the window frame, from the tiny microscopic gaps around the door that no amount of moss or cloth could ever truly seal. It was a thin, sharp cutting sound, a reminder that the enemy was not just battering the gates, but was also slipping its spies through the walls. It was the sound of the cold's patient, relentless infiltration. Then there were the sounds of the house. The cabin under this immense pressure was no longer a silent, inanimate object. It was alive. It was speaking. The massive pine logs that formed the walls and ceiling, shrinking in the impossible cold, began to groan. It was a deep, resonant, ancient sound, like the timbers of an old sailing ship in a storm. A long, low groan followed by a chorus of creaks as the wooden pegs and notches shifted by fractions of an inch. It was a sound of immense strain of a structure holding on against a force it was never truly designed to bear. It was the sound of the cabin fighting back, and punctuating these groans were sharper, more violent noises. Every few minutes a loud, sudden crack would echo through the small space as sharp and shocking as a pistol shot. Elias knew what it was, the sound of frost. The sap, still trapped deep within the logs, was freezing, expanding and splitting, the wood fibres from the inside out. He knew it didn't mean the walls were failing, but the sound was still a jolt to the nervous system, a percussive reminder of the destructive power at work. These were the big sounds, but the longer they sat, the more their ears adjusted and the more they noticed the smaller ones. The nervous rattle of the iron latch on the window shutter vibrating with each gust. The faint metallic clinking of the pots and pans hanging by the hearth swaying gently like wind chimes in a hurricane. These were the sounds of the cabin's fear, and finally there were the sounds of life, the tiny precious sounds of the family nearly drowned out by the chaos. The most important of these was the fire. It was their only ally in this fight, and it had its own language. There was the soft, steady hiss, as pockets of moisture in the wood turned to steam. There was the cheerful, busy crackle of the bark catching flame, a sound of defiant energy. And there was the occasional comforting thump as a log burned through and settled deeper into the glowing embers. The fire was the only thing in the world that was making a sound of creation, not destruction. It was the heart of the cabin, and as long as it was beating, they were alive. Beneath the sound of the fire was the sound of their own breathing. 3 small, rhythmic proofs of life. Elias's was slow and measured, as he sat on his stool, his eyes closed, listening, analysing, cataloguing every groan and crack. Anna's was a little faster, a little shallower, as she sat nestled against her mother's side, her eyes wide. And Sarah's was the steadiest of all, a silent anchor in the storm of sound, her hand resting on Anna's hair. They sat like that for what felt like an eternity, each lost in their own island of thought, connected only by the shared roar. The assault was relentless. It wasn't just a physical pressure on the walls, but a psychological one. The noise was designed to break your spirit, to make you feel small and hopeless, to convince you that the door would eventually splinter and the roof would eventually fly away. Sarah felt it. She saw the tension in the set of Elias's jaw, the fear that swam behind the wonder in Anna's eyes. A fortress she knew, no matter how well sealed, could still fall from the inside. The monstrous voice of the storm with its story of cold and death had to be answered. It had to be drowned out by a different kind of sound, a human sound, a story. She cleared her throat, and the tiny, simple noise was a revolution in the roaring dark. Elias opened his eyes. Anna looked up at her. The monster outside had been talking for long enough. It was her turn. She cleared her throat. It was a tiny sound, a speck of human noise against the monstrous engine of the storm, but it was enough. It was an act of deliberate creation. In the roaring darkness, Elias opened his eyes and looked at her. Anna, who had been staring into the fire as if hypnotized, shifted her gaze up to her mother's face. The monster outside had been telling its story of cold and chaos for long enough. It was her turn. Sarah didn't start with Once Upon a Time. She didn't offer a grand fable or a heroic epic. She knew that fiction would feel hollow against the brutal reality of the wind. She needed a truth, a warmer truth. She pulled Anna a little closer and pitched her voice just above the howl from the chimney. "Do you remember," she began, her voice soft but clear, "the raspberry thicket last summer? The one down by the creek where the sun is hottest in the afternoon?" She didn't wait for an answer. She began to paint the scene not with a brush but with words. She was building a world for them to inhabit right there in the center of the besieged cabin. Her first ingredient was the sun. She spoke of the heavy golden heat of a July afternoon, the kind of sun you can feel on your closed eyelids, the kind that soaks right into your bones. She described the feeling of the warm earth beneath their bare feet. Then she began to replace the sounds. The howl of the wind became the low, sleepy buzz of 1,000 bumblebees, drunk on nectar bumbling through the wildflowers. The sharp crack of the frost became the rhythmic, peaceful chirp of crickets hiding in the tall grass. The roar of the storm became the gentle, gurgling music of the creek as it tumbled over smooth grey stones. She was performing a kind of magic, a sonic alchemy, pushing back the sounds of winter with the memory of summer. She wasn't trying to make them forget the storm. She was reminding them that the world wasn't always a monster, that the sun would eventually return. The air smelled sweet. She continued, her eyes half closed as she looked into the past. It smelled of hot pine needles and damp earth, and those wild white flowers that grow by the water, and the raspberries. They were like little red jewels hidden amongst the green leaves. Remember how we had to hunt for them? The story's plot was the simplest one imaginable, a family picking berries on a summer day. She described Anna a serious little forager, getting more of the bright red juice on her chin and fingers than in the tin bucket she carried. She described Elias moving with his usual quiet focus, trying to carefully pluck the best berries without getting scratched by the thorns. She looked at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "And you, Elias, you tried to be so serious and proper, but by the end your hands were stained purple, and you looked like you'd gotten into a fight with a jam pot and lost." A flicker of a smile crossed Elias's face. For the first time in hours, the tense line of his jaw relaxed. He was still listening to the storm. He would never stop listening, but he was also listening to her. He was seeing the creek. He was feeling the sun. Anna, who had been a small, tense ball of fear, was now fully captivated. "And the frog mama," she chirped, her voice cutting through the memory. "The big one that jumped in the water. It made a big splash." "That's right, my love," Sarah said, stroking her hair. "A big grumpy-looking frog. He was probably the king of the creek, and we were interrupting his afternoon nap." She went on, her voice a low, steady murmur. She described the perfect, sharp, sweet taste of a raspberry, picked straight from the cane, still warm from the sun. She talked about how they'd finally given up their buckets, mostly full, and sat on the grassy bank, dipping their hot, dusty feet into the shocking cold of the creek water. She described the feeling of utter peace of a day's good work done, of being tired and full and safe in the sunshine. She spun the memory out as long as she could, her voice rising and falling with a gentle cadence, a human rhythm against the storm's chaotic one. She hadn't banished the storm. The wind still howled, the cabin still groaned. But she had shrunk it. She had built a second, smaller world inside the first, a world made of memory and love and the taste of summer raspberries. The monster was still outside, but for a little while it couldn't get in. Its voice was just noise now, a distant and unimportant backdrop to the world Sarah had created. Her story wound down as the memory family walked home in the imaginary twilight, the first stars beginning to appear in the imaginary sky. Soothed by the story, lulled by her mother's voice, and the warmth of the fire, Anna's breathing deepened. Her head grew heavy on Sarah's lap. She was drifting off to sleep. The story had worked. It had fought back the fear and brought them a small measure of peace. But peace, like firewood, is a finite resource. As the story ended and a comfortable silence settled over them, Elias's mind, momentarily unburdened, returned to his duties. His gaze, which had been lost in a summer memory, now sharpened and focused on the fire. It was burning brightly, a beautiful, mesmerizing pillar of life. Too brightly. He had kept it fed, wanting its cheerful roar to help fight off the gloom. His eyes flicked from the fire to the woodpile stacked against the wall. The fortress of logs that had seemed so immense just a few hours ago now looked smaller, worryingly smaller. He did a quick mental calculation, his frontiersman's brain tallying the logs burned against the hours of darkness left. And the numbers didn't add up. The story had brought them peace of mind. But the cost of that peace had been their fuel. Looking at the beautiful hungry flames and then at the dwindling woodpile, Elias realized with a sudden cold pang of dread that they were running out of both. The story had worked. It had built a small warm room in their minds, a sanctuary from the howling night. But the cruelest irony of survival is that sometimes the very thing that saves your spirit can endanger your body. The beautiful roaring fire that had held the darkness and fear at bay had been consuming its fuel with a relentless, cheerful appetite. And now the bill was coming due. Looking at the flames and then at the woodpile, Elias felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was the icy dread of a simple, brutal calculation. This was a new kind of fear. Not the primal fear of a wild animal or a sudden blizzard, but the quiet intellectual terror of a mathematical problem you know you cannot solve. It was the fear of the ledger book, the terror of the empty pantry, the quiet panic of a captain who realizes he has miscalculated the distance to the shore. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stared, his mind, which had just been wandering through a sun-drenched memory, now becoming a ruthlessly efficient calculating machine. He wasn't just seeing logs anymore. He was seeing BTUs. He was seeing minutes of burn time. His eyes scanned the pile, automatically categorizing the wood. The thick, dense oak logs were the gold standard, slow-burning and hot. The pine was silver-burning, bright and fast, good for morale, but poor for longevity. The birch and aspen were currency of last resort. He did the math. He counted the remaining oak logs. 7. He pictured the hours of darkness stretching before them in an unknowable expanse, but he guessed at least 6 more until the first hint of dawn. He factored in the dropping temperature, knowing that as the night wore on, each log would have to fight harder, would give them less warmth for the same price. And his internal ledger, the one he had been keeping his entire life, delivered its stark and unforgiving verdict. It wasn't enough. Not if they continued like this. And so there, in the roaring silence of the cabin, he was faced with an impossible choice, a classic dilemma known to anyone who has ever faced a long night with dwindling resources. His first option was to conserve. He could break his rhythm, stop feeding the fire with its accustomed generosity. He could let the beautiful roaring flame die down, nursing it, keeping it to a bare minimum bed of glowing embers. The advantage was clear. Stretching the wood supply would almost certainly guarantee they had some fire until morning. It was the safe bet. The disadvantage, however, was equally clear. The temperature inside the cabin would plummet. The cold which they had held at the threshold would be invited in. It would be a long, miserable, shivering night, a guaranteed suffering that would test their endurance to its absolute limit. It was a slow, managed surrender. His second option was to hope. He could continue as he was feeding the fire, keeping the cabin relatively warm, keeping the psychological comfort of the light and heat alive. He could gamble that the storm would break sooner than expected, that the coldest part of the night wouldn't be as cold as he feared. He could bet on hope. The advantage was a few more hours of precious life-giving warmth. The disadvantage was the risk of catastrophic failure. If he was wrong, they would run out of wood completely in the deepest, darkest, coldest hour of the night, that terrible time just before dawn, when all hope dies. That would be checkmate. There was no third option. It was a choice between definite prolonged misery and potential absolute disaster. He looked over at Sarah. Anna was asleep on her lap, her face peaceful in the flickering firelight, oblivious to the silent debate raging just a few feet away. Sarah's eyes met his across the small space. She couldn't have heard his thoughts, but she didn't need to. She saw the grim mathematics playing out on his face. She saw the war between prudence and hope. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of profound and total trust. It said, "Whatever you choose, I am with you." That was all he needed. He had his answer. He was not a gambler. A frontiersman couldn't afford to be. He was a farmer of probabilities, and he always chose the harvest he could count on, no matter how meager. He picked up the long iron poker. For a moment it seemed like he might use it to nudge a new log onto the fire. Instead, he did the opposite. He reached into the heart of the blaze, and with 2 sharp, deliberate movements, he pushed the burning logs apart. He broke the fire's heart. The effect was immediate. The roaring, cheerful flame collapsed in on itself. The bright, dancing light that had filled the cabin shrank, pulling back from the walls, retreating into the hearth. The shadows in the corners, which had been held at bay, surged forward, swallowing the room. The cheerful crackle died, replaced by a low, defeated hiss. The temperature in the room didn't just feel like it was dropping. You could see it happen as the world of the cabin became dimmer, quieter, and colder. He had made his choice. A long cold night in exchange for the guarantee of a dawn. The vibrant heart of the cabin was now just a soft red pulse. And as the human world within those four walls drew in on itself, becoming smaller and quieter, the vast inhuman world outside continued its silent, indifferent spectacle. He had made his choice a long cold night in exchange for the guarantee of a dawn. The vibrant heart of the cabin was now just a soft red pulse. And as the human world within those four walls drew in on itself, becoming smaller and quieter, the vast inhuman world outside continued its silent, indifferent spectacle. Let's leave them there for a moment, huddled by the embers. Let's drift outside, passing through the log walls as if we were ghosts, and see what they cannot. From a distance, the cabin is almost nothing. A small dark rectangle in a universe of white, barely visible under the cold, clinical light of a high moon. The only sign of the life and death struggle happening within is a thin, almost invisible whisper of smoke rising from the chimney, dissolving instantly into the frigid air. The house looks less like a home and more like a stone dropped into a frozen sea. The world it sits in has been transformed. The storm's violent wind has passed, leaving behind a world redesigned by absolute cold. The snow is no longer soft powder. It's a hard, glittering crust that crunches under the weight of nothing. It shines under the moonlight not like snow, but like a field of ground glass and diamond dust. And the trees have become works of art. Every branch, every twig, every single pine needle is encased in a thick, perfectly clear sleeve of ice. They are no longer living wood, but glass sculptures of themselves. When a slight breeze, the last dying breath of the storm, stirs the high branches, they don't sway. They chime, a faint, high, brittle music like 1,000 tiny glass bells, ringing in a cathedral of ice. It is a sound of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty. Now let's look up, past the crystal forest into the sky. The storm has scoured the atmosphere clean, leaving behind a perfect airless void. The sky is a flawless sheet of black velvet, and punched into that velvet are the stars. They don't twinkle here. There's no atmospheric haze to soften them. They are sharp, steady, unforgiving points of silver fire. They are not romantic. They are terrifyingly clear, ancient, and distant. The Milky Way is not a gentle cloud of light. It's a thick, brilliant tear in the fabric of the night, a river of suns flowing from one horizon to the other. And hanging above it all is the moon, a skull-white disk of polished bone, casting a light that gives no warmth, a light that only illuminates the magnificent frozen perfection of the dead world below. This is the great silent engine of the cold, this cosmic clockwork of stars and moons and absolute zero. It is not angry. It is not malicious. It feels nothing at all for the three warm-blooded creatures huddled in the wooden box below. Their struggle is too small, their lifespan too short to register on this scale. The universe is not their enemy. It simply does not know they exist. The spectacle had put on its grandest, coldest show. But inside that tiny sleeping box of wood, the crystal trees and diamond stars didn't matter. The great machine of the cosmos was irrelevant. All that mattered now was the slow creeping cold and the simple, profound question of how three small, warm bodies could outlast the vast frozen night by sharing a single space, a single blanket, a single breath. The universe had put on its grandest, coldest show. The crystal trees and diamond stars shone on. But inside that tiny sleeping box of wood, the spectacle didn't matter. All that mattered now was the slow creeping cold and the simple, profound question of how three small, warm bodies could outlast the vast frozen night by sharing a single space, a single blanket, a single breath. The answer came without words. The fire, now a sad red pulse in the hearth, offered little more than a memory of heat. The ambient temperature in the cabin was dropping fast. You could feel it in your teeth. Elias knew the time for strategy and resource management was over. The battle of wits had been fought. Now it was time for the final, most ancient strategy of all warm-blooded creatures. It was time for the huddle. He rose stiffly from his stool, his joints protesting in the cold. He looked at Sarah, who was still holding their sleeping daughter, and simply nodded toward the corner where their bed stood. It wasn't a command, it was a concession, the final retreat. They were abandoning the main room, the living space, and falling back to the last defensible position, the nest. The bed was a masterpiece of frontier engineering, which is to say it was simple, sturdy, and not remotely concerned with comfort as we might know it. A thick wooden frame laced with rope held up a deep mattress stuffed with a rustling mixture of dried straw and corn husks. It was, however, the warmest place in their world, and they were about to make it warmer. What followed was another quiet ritual. Sarah, careful not to wake the sleeping girl in her arms, moved to the bed, first sitting on its edge. Elias, meanwhile, became a gatherer. He moved through the dim cabin, collecting every piece of fabric and fur they owned. First came the crown jewel of their collection, a heavy, magnificent bearskin, a prize from a rare trading encounter. He laid it over the bed, fur side down, its sheer weight, a promise of insulation. The thing probably weighed 50 pounds and smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. Next came the 2 wool blankets they owned. They were scratchy, heavy, and brutally effective. Thread count was not a concept that troubled them. Their only job was to trap air, and they did it well. Finally, Elias took off his own heavy canvas coat, the one lined with sheepskin, and added it to the pile. In this war, every soldier, no matter how small, was sent to the front lines. The bed was no longer a bed. It was a layered fortification of warmth. The arrangement was just as deliberate. This was a parent sandwich with the most precious ingredient in the middle. Anna, still lost to the world, was gently laid in the centre of the bed. She was the glowing coal, the pilot light of their family that had to be protected at all costs. Sarah curled around one side of her, her body a soft, warm barrier. Elias then lay down on the other, completing the human cocoon. He pulled the mountain of blankets and furs up over them, tucking it in tightly around their shoulders and feet. For a moment the cold was shocking. The sheets, despite the bearskin, had been leaching heat into the room and felt like slabs of ice. But then slowly a small miracle of physics began to occur. The heat from their 3 bodies, which had been dissipating into the vast cold of the room, was now trapped in the tiny shared space of the nest. Their separate pools of warmth began to merge, creating a single life-sustaining pocket in the heart of the frozen night. The shift was palpable. The active struggle was over. Elias was no longer a frantic accountant of firewood. He was a furnace. Sarah was no longer a storyteller fighting fear with memory. She was a blanket. Their roles had been stripped down to their most essential biological functions, to generate heat and to share it. Elias lay on his back, staring up into the darkness, the weight of the furs pressing down on him. The storm still raged outside, but it sounded different now, more distant. The groans of the cabin were muffled by the layers of their nest. The only sounds that mattered were the ones right next to him. He could feel the gentle rise and fall of Sarah's breathing. He could hear the soft, whispery sighs of his daughter as she dreamed. After a few minutes, their breathing began to align, falling into a single, unified rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The slow, steady pulse of a single life temporarily made of 3 people. The cold was still there, a constant heavy pressure against their fragile shield of blankets. But it was a manageable pressure. It was a siege they could withstand. Elias lay awake, listening no longer for the sounds of the storm, but for the sound of his family's breathing. It was the only metric of success left. And in the centre of it all, shielded from the cold, insulated by the love and body heat of her parents, Anna was the warmest of them all. Her small body, no longer needing to waste its energy fighting the chill, was free. Her mind untroubled by the grim mathematics of survival, or the weight of responsibility, was free to do what a child's mind does best. It was free to escape. It was free to dream. Cocooned in the centre of their shared warmth, shielded from the cold by the bodies of her parents, Anna's mind, untroubled by the grim mathematics of survival, was free to do what a child's mind does best. It was free to escape. It was free to dream. And so she did. Her journey out of the cold, dark cabin wasn't a journey at all. It was a gentle dissolve. The oppressive weight of the blankets faded into nothing. The scratch of the wool vanished. The howling of the wind, the groaning of the logs, the sound of her parents' worried breathing. It all receded, replaced by a low, happy hum. The hum of a world vibrantly and possibly alive. She found herself standing not in the dark, but in a world saturated with a light so warm and golden it seemed to have weight. She was in a meadow, the same one from her mother's story, but this was the director's cut, remastered by a child's imagination. The sky wasn't just blue. It was a deep, brilliant, cloudless blue that hurt your eyes with its perfection. The grass wasn't just green. It was 1,000 shades of green, from the bright lime-coloured new shoots to the deep emerald blades that had been growing all summer. and scattered through the grass were explosions of colour-yellow dandelions, purple clover, and tiny white flowers she didn't know the names of. The air itself was different. It didn't bite or sting. It was a soft, warm blanket that smelled of damp, rich soil and the sweet perfume of sun-baked pine needles. She took a deep breath, and the air filled her lungs with the scent of life. She was barefoot, and the ground beneath her feet wasn't frozen solid. It was soft and cool and yielding. She curled her toes and felt the tickle of the grass. This was the world her mother had promised her. This was the memory she had clung to. In the dream, she wasn't huddled or afraid. She was running. Her small legs, which in the real world were curled up and still, were now pumping with joyous energy. She ran not away from anything, but towards everything. Her quest in the strange meandering logic of dreams was to follow the creek, the same creek where she had dipped her feet in her mother's story. Here it was a ribbon of sparkling silver light gurgling a happy secret song as it tumbled over mossy rocks. She ran alongside it, chasing something that fluttered just ahead of her, a single enormous butterfly. Its wings were the same impossible blue as the sky edged with a fine black velvet. It danced in the air, always just out of reach of her outstretched fingers, leading her deeper into the heart of the perfect summer day. Her parents were there too. Not as they were in the waking world, tense, silent figures in the dark, but as benevolent giants made of sunlight. They stood at the edge of the meadow, not speaking, simply watching her. Their faces were smooth, unworried, and filled with a quiet, peaceful pride. They were the silent, smiling guardians of her perfect world, the proof that she was completely and utterly safe. The blue butterfly led her on past a thicket of raspberry canes, so heavy with fruit that they bent to the ground. It led her through a stand of aspen trees, their leaves shimmering and chattering in a gentle breeze. Finally, it led her to a clearing where a huge ancient oak tree stood. At the base of the tree, from between two gnarled roots, the creek bubbled up from the earth. The spring, the source of it all. The butterfly, its mission complete, came to rest on a patch of soft green moss by the water's edge, gently fanning its brilliant blue wings. Anna's chase was over. She laughed a sound that was pure and clear, and then plopped down onto the grass, her body tired in that wonderful boneless way that only comes after a long day of play. She lay on her back, her arms outstretched, and stared up at the blue, blue sky. The sun was warm on her face. The bees were buzzing. The world was good. Her dream was not just a random collection of images. It was a profound act of rebellion. It was her spirit's refusal to accept the cold, dead world outside the cabin walls as the only reality. It was a deep biological assertion that warmth and life were the true state of things, and that winter was just a temporary, unpleasant interruption. It was the engine of survival humming away in the quietest part of the night, generating a fuel more powerful than any log hope. She lay there in her sun-drenched meadow at perfect peace. But even in a dream, nothing lasts forever. Her perfect summer day began to dissolve, not into the nightmare of the storm, but into something else. The blue of the sky seemed to fade, becoming a little paler. The buzzing of the bees grew fainter. It was not a sad ending. It was just a change. Her dream had done its job. It had been the bridge. It had carried her safely across the deepest, darkest, coldest hours of the night. And now something else was coming. In the real world, beyond the nest of blankets and the ice-encased walls, a long-forgotten law of physics was beginning to reassert itself. The planet, after all, was still turning, and the night, no matter how long, could not last forever. Her perfect summer day was dissolving not into the nightmare of the storm, but into something else, something quiet and grey. Because in the real world, beyond the nest of blankets and the ice-encased walls, a long-forgotten law of physics was beginning to reassert itself. The planet, after all, was still turning, and the night, no matter how long, could not last forever. The first person to know the night was breaking was Elias. Not because he saw anything, but because he had been lying awake for hours, his body a tense instrument calibrated to the sounds of the storm, and the sounds were changing. For what felt like an eternity, the wind had been a physical assault, a monstrous, mindless rage throwing itself against their walls. But now the character of the assault had shifted. The violent, percussive shoves that had made the cabin shudder were gone. The high shrieking howl from the chimney, the sound of a tortured animal, had softened, dropping in pitch to a low, mournful moan. It was the sound of a great beast exhausted by its own fury finally settling. The malice was gone. The active personal attack had ended, replaced by the indifferent impersonal sigh of a very, very strong wind. It was just weather again. To Elias, this change was as loud and clear as a church bell ringing in the town square. The siege was lifting. He lay perfectly still, not daring to move, not wanting to break the spell. He kept listening, and as he listened to the dying wind, his eyes began to register the second change. A change so subtle it was almost imaginary. The darkness. All night the darkness in the cabin had been absolute. A thick, suffocating velvet blackness that swallowed all shapes. It was a darkness you could feel a physical presence. But now it was softening. The perfect inky black was being diluted as if a single drop of grey paint had been stirred into a vast can of black. It wasn't light, not even close. It was simply a lessening of the dark. It was the difference between a sealed tomb and a room with a covered window. The mere possibility of sight had returned to the world. Slowly shapes began to re-emerge from the void like ghosts taking form. He could just begin to distinguish the hulking dark mass of the woodpile from the slightly less dark wall behind it. The sharp corner of the table became a faint geometric line. He could see the space between himself and the hearth. It's the moment the universe decides to slowly, almost grudgingly turn the dimmer switch from 0 to 0.1. It isn't much, but after a lifetime of blackness, it is everything. This subtle shift in the environment, this quiet permission to see again, was what finally stirred Sarah from her own shallow, watchful state of semi-sleep. She didn't wake with a start. It was more like her consciousness surfaced gently from the deep. She opened her eyes and she saw it too, a world of charcoal and slate-grey shadows where before there had been only nothing. The oppressive weight of the absolute dark had lifted. Her eyes found Elias's in the dimness. There were no words. There was no need. A whole novel was exchanged in that single silent look across their sleeping child. "Did you feel that? Did you see it?" his eyes asked. Hers answered yes. "I think so. I think we made it through." It was a moment of relief so profound it felt like a physical weight lifting off their chests. The fear, the specific gnawing fear that this particular night would be their last, was gone. They were cold, they were exhausted, they were hungry. But they were here, and the sun, however distant, was coming back. That was the victory. But Elias needed proof. He needed to see it. He began the slow, careful process of extraction, moving with the deliberate caution of a man trying not to trigger a landslide. He slid his arm out from under the blankets, the frigid air hitting his skin like a physical blow. It was a sharp reminder that the dawn had brought light, but it had not yet brought warmth. The cold in the cabin was still a dangerous living thing. He carefully disentangled his legs, swinging them over the side of the bed. His bare feet touched the floorboards, and he bit back a gasp as the shocking cold shot up his legs. He stood there for a moment, a statue in the grey gloom, before moving silently, deliberately towards the shuttered window. He was about to unseal their world. He was about to reverse the ritual they had performed what felt like a lifetime ago. For 12 hours, their entire universe had been contained within these four walls, a world of darkness, sound, and stories. Now he was about to let the rest of creation back in. He reached the window, his fingers stiff and clumsy with cold, as they fumbled for the thick, smooth wood of the locking bar. He took a deep, steadying breath of the frigid air, his own breath pluming in front of him like a ghost. The only question left was what kind of world was he about to reveal? He took a deep, steadying breath of the frigid air, his own breath pluming in front of him like a ghost. He wrapped his stiff fingers around the smooth, cold wood of the locking bar. He lifted. The sound it made in the profound quiet of the cabin was shockingly loud, a deep groaning scrape of wood against wood. It was the sound of a tomb being unsealed. He pushed the heavy shutter outward and it swung open into the new day. Light flooded the small space, but it was not the warm, friendly golden light of a normal sunrise. It was a strange second-hand light, a bright bluish-white clinical glare that seemed to be reflecting off every surface in the world at once. It was the light of a world made of mirrors, and it carried no heat at all. It was the light of a diamond, beautiful and cold. Elias squinted his pupils, accustomed to 12 hours of near-total darkness, shrinking painfully. The first thing he saw was the window itself. Over the course of the night, the moisture of their breath trapped inside had frozen against the single pane of glass, but it hadn't frozen into a simple, opaque sheet of white. The cold in its infinite alien artistry had etched a masterpiece onto the glass. It was a forest of frost ferns, a universe of tiny, intricate ice feathers, and delicate six-sided starbursts that looked like frozen snowflakes. It was nature's own stained glass, a temporary monument to the coldest night. He couldn't see through it clearly. He pressed his palm against the pane. The faint warmth of his skin, a shocking contrast to the bitter cold of the glass, began to melt a small round circle in the frost. He leaned in, pressing his eye to this new peephole, and looked out. For the first time in half a day, he was looking at something other than his family or his dwindling woodpile. He was looking at the morning after report written in a language of ice. The world he saw was his own, but translated into a different dimension. Every surface, every texture he knew was gone, replaced by a single, unifying element, a thick, clear, glittering sheath of ice. The familiar rough-hewn logs of his woodpile were now smooth, glistening bars of glass. The simple wooden posts of his fence were transformed into crystal pillars. It was a world that was profoundly beautiful and deeply fundamentally wrong. This tiny, blurry view wasn't enough. He needed the full picture. He turned from the window and walked to the main door. He lifted the heavy bar, another loud pronouncement in the quiet room, and pulled the door inward just a crack. The air that sliced in was different from the storm's wind. It was perfectly still, brutally cold but clean. It smelled of nothing but pure crystalline ice and the faint electric scent of ozone left behind by the storm. He took another breath and pulled the door fully open. He just stood there for a long moment on the threshold between his dark, cramped world of survival and the vast, glittering world outside. The beauty was breathtaking. The sun, still low on the horizon, was catching the million facets of ice, fracturing the light into brilliant, painful sparks. The trees drooped low, their branches heavy and burdened, encased in sleeves of glass. It was a world that would be silent if not for the occasional high-pitched tinkle of a piece of ice breaking loose and shattering on the frozen ground. But Elias was not a poet. He was a survivor, and his eyes were not seeing beauty. They were conducting an assessment. He scanned for damage. The roof of the cabin, remarkably, was still intact. The small, flimsy woodshed hadn't collapsed. These were the first entries on the positive side of his mental ledger. Small victories. Then his eyes fell on his primary concern. The lean-to, the flimsy shelter, where they kept their most valuable asset, Bessie the cow. Her survival was in many ways more critical than the integrity of the woodshed. He began to walk his feet, making a loud, glassy crunching sound in the snow with every step. He reached the lean-to. A thick curtain of icicles, some as thick as his arm, hung from its roof. He had to snap them off with his hands, the sharp cold biting at his skin just to peer inside. The moment of truth had arrived. He leaned in, his heart pounding in his chest, and he saw her. She was standing, which was a victory in itself. Her brown winter coat was covered in a delicate tracery of her own frozen breath. She was shivering, her whole body trembling with cold and misery, but she was alive. She turned her large placid head toward him, her eyes seeming to ask what in the world had just happened, and she let out a low, pathetic, profoundly miserable moo. And that miserable moo was the most beautiful sound Elias had heard in his entire life. It was the sound of his family's future. It was the sound of milk for Anna, of butter to be churned and sold, of life continuing. It was the greatest victory of them all. He reached in and gave her a rough, appreciative pat on the neck, a wordless gesture of thanks. His work for the day was now clear. Get her water. Get her food. Break the ice from her trough. The struggle wasn't over. It had just changed its shape. He turned and looked back at the cabin. Sarah was standing in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the faint warm glow of the embers inside. She had been watching, waiting for the verdict on their four-legged partner in survival. He didn't need to shout. He just met her eyes across the glittering frozen expanse and gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. The nod said everything. She's alive. We're alive. The world is still here. The assessment was complete. The damage was cosmetic. The core assets were secure. The world had been remade in glass and light, and while it was dangerous and beautiful, it was survivable. And now, after a night spent fighting for their lives, it was time for the simplest, most profound ritual of a new day. It was time for a drink of hot water. He gave the nod. The assessment was complete. The damage was cosmetic. The core assets were secure. The world had been remade in glass and light, and while it was dangerous and beautiful, it was survivable. And now, after a night spent fighting for their lives, it was time for the simplest, most profound ritual of a new day. It was time for a drink of hot water. Elias crunched his way back across the glittering snow, each step a small testament to the strange new world. He reached the cabin door where Sarah stood waiting, her face pale and tired in the sharp morning light, but her eyes clear. For the first time in what felt like a year, they spoke. Their voices were raspy from the dry, cold air. "She's cold," Elias said, his voice low, "but she's strong." "Good," was all Sarah said in return. It was enough. They closed the heavy door, shutting out the brilliant, overwhelming glare for a moment, choosing to return to the dim, controllable world they had defended all night. The first order of business was to formally and finally declare victory over the cold, and that meant rebuilding the heart of their home. Elias knelt at the hearth. He was now performing the exact opposite of the grim ritual he had undertaken in the middle of the night. He was not a miser of heat anymore. He was a spendthrift. He pushed the few remaining red embers together into a tight, hopeful pile. He ignored the precious, slow-burning oak and reached for the faster, more cheerful birch and pine. The goal was no longer endurance. It was celebration. He shredded some birch bark into a fine, papery nest and placed it gently on the embers. Then he knelt lower his face close to the hearth and blew. A single, steady, patient breath. The embers glowed brighter, a fierce orange. He blew again. A wisp of smoke curled up, and then a tiny yellow flame no bigger than his thumb flickered into existence. It's the oldest and most powerful magic in the human story, the deliberate creation of a tiny portable sun. He added more kindling, and the small flame grew eagerly, licking at the dry wood. In less than a minute the fire was back, not just as embers, but as a proper living flame, crackling and hissing and throwing a warm dancing light across the cabin walls. It was the sound of victory. Now it was Sarah's turn. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows her domain intimately. She took the heavy cast-iron pot filled with the snow she'd had the foresight to bring in, and with a soft grunt of effort hung it on the iron crane over the fire. The flames immediately enveloped its black-rounded bottom. They waited, watching the slow miracle of the thaw. The snow first seemed to shrink in on itself, becoming dense and wet. Then the edges began to melt, creating a pool of slush. Finally, with a soft sigh, the last of the white surrendered, and the pot was filled with clear, cold water. Soon tiny bubbles began to form on the bottom, and a gentle plume of steam, the most beautiful sight in the world, began to rise into the air. Sarah reached for a small wooden box on the mantelpiece. Inside were the dried, crumpled leaves of the mint that grew wild by the creek in summer. She took a small pinch and dropped it into the steaming water. The sharp, clean scent of mint instantly filled the air, a ghost of summer, a direct counterpoint to the sterile smell of the ice outside. It was the scent of Anna's dream made real. She gently shook Anna's shoulder. "Wake up, little bird," she murmured. "The sun is back." Anna's eyes fluttered open. She was groggy, confused, her mind still half stuck in a field of green. She looked around the dim cabin at her parents at the fire, and a slow smile of relief spread across her face. She was safe. Sarah poured the steaming, fragrant water into their 3-chipped tin cups. The family sat together on the floor close to the fire, not on chairs, but right there on the warm planks. They didn't drink right away. They just held the cups, letting the searing heat seep into their numb, frozen fingers. It was a lifeline, a direct transfusion of warmth into their very bones. Then together they took the first sip. The hot liquid was a shock, chasing the deep internal cold from their chests. It was a wave of pure, life-giving heat, unknotting the tension that had been coiled in their muscles all night. It was more than a drink. It was a sacrament. It was the taste of survival. It's a funny thing. You can endure a war with the cosmos, an assault by the very elements themselves, but you don't truly feel you've won until you have a hot cup of something in your hands. It's the universal human signal that the great struggle is over, and for a moment you are simply home. They sat in a comfortable, exhausted silence, sipping their mint tea. Outside, the sun was climbing higher, and the harsh blue light was softening, admitting touches of gold as it slanted through the frosted window. Elias looked at Sarah over Anna's head, and their eyes met. The look held everything: the shared memory of the terror, the profound exhaustion, the quiet, unshakable triumph, and a love that had been tested by the absolute cold and had not been broken. The cabin was filled with the gentle sounds of sipping and the cheerful crackle of a well-fed fire. The long cold war was over. The siege had been lifted. They had endured, and in that quiet moment holding fast to the simple warmth of a tin cup they had won. And that's where we'll leave them. Sitting on the floor of their tiny life-affirming cabin surrounded by the wreckage of a beautiful frozen world, the three of them sipping warm mint tea from tin cups as the morning sun begins to pour liquid gold through the frosted window. Their long cold war is over. The great ordeal of the night has passed. Soon a new day of work will begin. Elias will have to dig out the path, break the thick ice from Bessie's water trough and check his snares. Sarah will have to make a proper meal, take stock of their supplies, and begin the endless task of putting their small world back in order. But that is work for the day. The work of the night, the simple, brutal, all-important work of just staying alive is done. They have won. It's funny to think about what their victory actually looked like. It wasn't a grand cinematic triumph. No one wrestled a polar bear. No one gave a rousing speech as the music swelled. The movie version of their story would probably be a box office flop. Too much sitting, not enough witty dialogue. Their survival was quieter and far more profound than that. It was a triumph of the small, a victory woven from 100 tiny correct decisions and quiet, humble acts. It was in noticing the strange bruised colour of the sky. It was in the patient, methodical ritual of packing moss into the walls. It was in the strategic genius of telling a story about summer raspberries to fight off the fear. It was in the grim, painful calculus of letting the fire die down to save fuel. It was in the simple animal instinct of huddling together for warmth. They didn't conquer nature. You don't conquer an ocean or a blizzard. They endured it. They respected its power, read its intentions, and then made themselves a small enough target that its great mindless fury passed them by. They bent so they did not break. And then they waited for the dawn. And here you are, centuries later, listening to their story, lying in a place that would seem like a king's magical palace to them. A place where the walls don't groan, and the wind doesn't howl through the cracks. A place where warmth isn't a dwindling pile of wood to be rationed, but a number on a thermostat that you can change with the press of a button. The greatest monsters of their age, the raw elemental forces of cold and darkness, have been slain for you, not with a sword, but with insulation, with central heating, with engineering. The invisible shield of progress and comfort that surrounds you now is the legacy of 1,000,000 forgotten nights just like this one. And because of that, your job tonight is much, much simpler than theirs. You do not need to stand guard. There is no woodpile to count in your head. There is no strange sound in the wind to analyze. You don't have to worry if you will be warm enough to see the morning. You will be. You're safe. The fortress has already been built for you, so now you can let go. Let the story of Elias and Sarah and Anna fade away like a dream of a sun-drenched meadow. Their long night is over, and that means your long day can be over too. Let the world outside your window do what it will. It cannot reach you here. Give your body permission to unclench. Give your mind permission to go quiet. Their dawn has come, and now, so can yours. You can rest now. Sleep well.